Hey guys, hope you are well and thanks for joining us again for another Elite Coach live session where we bring you information that can help you to become the elite coach that you're wanting to become. We are joining you a little bit later today, just through a bit of conflict in schedules and just trying to make sure everybody's schedule marries up. We should be having Joshua joining us at any moment now. So he will be joining us on screen. But as always, for you guys that are watching on YouTube, listen to us on Spotify, watching us on Facebook, make sure that you do like the comment, make sure that you do subscribe. Just make sure that you can keep up with all of the great information that we are putting out there. So before we dive into today's session, what's kind of prompted it is, I don't know if anybody who's listening to this or watch this followed the European athletics championships and what's kind of prompted it, and it certainly forced me to reflect on what I do as a coach, but it was the comments by Dina Asher Smith and then Ailish McColgan afterwards, and it was quite interesting because they were talking about the menstrual cycle period, and obviously Dina came out and said it's had a massive impact on her cramp during races. She was saying the lack of studies, the lack of research that's gone into it needs to be addressed. We need to get around the stigma of talking about these things with our athletes within sport. And then kind of Ailish confirmed that and said, I don't understand in today's world why it's such a taboo subject. And I sort of just started to go over it and reflect on it myself, because the simple fact is, am I doing enough? Am I looking at the research on this a little bit more? Am I looking into a greater detail? So I thought it'd be great to get Joshua on, who's does a lot of this work as well, but also just use it to challenge myself, because as coaches, we're always wanting to grow. And speaking of the main man himself, here he is. Mr. Joshua Davidson, mate, how we doing, buddy? We okay?
I'm good, thank you. Had a few technical issues, so I'm outside using my phone now on a lovely pitch, though.
Oh, mate, I'm very, very jealous. I'm very jealous. But yeah, it's all good, mate. It's all good. So I was literally just filling the guise of why this conversation came up, really, and obviously off the back of Dina Asher Smith's comments at the European Athletics Championships and Ailish McColgan. And there was quite a lot of backlash on social media. And I think you could say anything on social media and get backlash these days. But I thought it'd be great to sort of pick that on. But first and foremost, mate, how are you doing? How's life treating you?
Brilliant. Like really good at the moment. Busy. I think big part of being an S&C coach, or anybody that's got, like, it seems to be natural to have about two or three side hustles now. But if you weren't be busy, you'd be complaining, wouldn't you? So I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, mate. I think there's definitely a lot of kinetic energy with coaches, isn't it? We have to keep moving. We have to run that busy idiot syndrome every now and again. But no, it's good to hear you're going well, mate. And the beard game is strong, mate. Very, very strong.
I got it touched up just for this.
Oh, mate, you can see, mate. You can see it's powerful. It's powerful.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, mate, obviously, let's dive straight into it, because obviously I don't want to beat around the bush, and at the end of the day, people feel free to disagree or agree with us or anything like that. But what did you make of Dina Ash's comments of saying that we need to do more research into the period, we need to look at it? And I think there was one sentence that didn't, I don't know, just rubbed me up the wrong way, and saying if it was anything to do with men's sports, it would have been research and it would have been a problem that was solved. But I just want to chuck that on you, mate. What was your initial reaction to that comment?
So I think the thing is, there's lots of positive things to take away from that. So there is a lot of well, not a lot, not compared to other stuff, but especially, I mean, if you were looking into it further, there's a researcher out in Nottingham Trent called Kirsty Sale, I believe, and some of her PhD students have done some really good stuff looking at the effect of the menstrual cycle. Because I think it's quite rightly so, you can't just approach the coaching of female athletes as them being slightly smaller or weaker men, because physiologically there are differences. It's the same way you coach children, different to you would coach adults, because of that fundamental difference in physiology. And I think personally, one of the things, if I was accounting, I've done lots of things wrong in my professional career, but I didn't properly have an understanding of the menstrual cycle when I first started working with female athletes. And it's not that, oh, that has to be the focus of our training and thoughts, but it's more a case of if you've got an understanding of it and perhaps the individual response, because it's two things really, understanding what the menstrual cycle is and also understanding the effect of oral contraceptives on your athletes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that you have to have these conversations daily, but it's useful to be somebody, because as an S&C coach, you have a lot of contact with your players, don't you? And that's one of the great parts of our job. But them having your athletes able to talk to you about that sort of stuff, and you having the sort of professional maturity to be able to have those conversations. Because it's not that there's been no research done. There is some really good research out there, but it's not being pushed. And unfortunately, the research, basically, like all research, is pretty much meh, it depends. There's nothing out there saying, oh, you must do this, you must do that. The key sort of take-home points are sometimes it can affect your endurance. So you might have a nullified perception of pain, and you might be able to do a little bit more. So that's a good thing. But then there are other things in and around how it might affect mood, irritability. You can have a lot of athletes, irrespective of age, can have like quite severe symptoms of like pain and things like that. So realistically, just as a coach, it's just something to be aware of. I don't think it's something fundamentally that has been a massive disadvantage, but I think it's just something useful to be aware of, so that when you're working with athletes and talking to them, you sort of understand what they're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely, and like real great points. I think what is interesting is obviously the what it's brought up, and I think it seemed to really split. Like I say, like anything, nobody can really sit on the fence. Nobody really sits on the middle anymore, do they? They always go to the extremes.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's so far away from the fence, it's ridiculous these days. And I think you had people saying she's just using it as an excuse because she underperformed. She got cramped. It's part of it. Was that one of the things that we should be considering? The other side of it is sport is male dominated and we're just trying to suppress women and we hate women and all that type of stuff. So then as a coach, you're sort of looking on the outside looking in thinking, I don't even want to entertain this conversation because it's so far removed from reality. It's just, she said this when she's incredibly disappointed. There is an air of reality to it. You know, research just isn't pushed. It's just not at the top of agenda for any of the mainstream media unless they cherry pick certain statistics, you know. But I think it was, for me as a coach, I found it difficult looking from the outside in because I'm like, how can I actually enter this conversation from a rational standpoint without just getting absolutely bombarded and getting pulled from left to right? I don't know if you felt like that, or just from the outside looking in, it was quite interesting that.
Yeah, and I think, and not in like a disrespectful way, but a lot of the times when people comment on things relevant to coaching, relevant to anything like this, you normally tend to find that it's the people that aren't necessarily heavily involved with the stuff they're talking about. Everybody loves having an opinion, and obviously social media tends to turn into a bit of a swamp, and it's like, oh, I'm going to shout my opinion, you shout yours. But I always do try and take a step back, and because obviously I'm like half coach, half academic, I try and straddle that line sort of, because in reality, no, I don't think anyone's actively trying to suppress female athletes. I don't think anybody ever gets up, no matter who you are, and says, oh, I'm going to do a bad job today. I think everybody always tries to do their best. But I think, yeah, if you ask an athlete, depending on how they've performed or something like that, they're probably going to come up with the one thing they're feeling then and there, aren't they? And if they have had some kind of negative experience or symptoms, they're going to point towards that. But the thing is, it's really difficult to do research into it, because if you imagine, it's not as simple as, and again, I'm endangering mansplaining here, so I'll probably get attacked on Twitter, but it's very difficult to do comprehensive research into this area, because every woman's physiology is different in terms of the length of her cycle, and then in terms of things like we mentioned already, oral contraceptives, whether you're on a single, whether you're on a combine, something like that. So it's really actually difficult to do meaningful research, when in reality, you know, people talk about research as if it's the most useful thing in the world. it's great and it's good to have an evidence base, but coaches need stuff that they can just access now. Like, what can I do? What can I do with this particular athlete? Is there some information that helps? I don't need full comprehensive meta-analysis to tell me on some days if my athlete isn't feeling 100% because of whatever reason, then I back off. Or if they've got something in our preparation, say we're doing a taper for a big event like an athletics event, and something's happening 2 days out that I can't control. Okay, well, we can't control it, so there's no point blowing up about it, is there?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the key things there is when you obviously coaching female athletes, it's just a variable, no different to if anybody is moving or going through a stressful situation in life. You know, maybe you've got. I remember coaching some rugby players who their partner had just had a baby, so sleepless nights and stuff. That is going to have an impact on the type of training, the type of things that you do, the recovery protocols, etc., etc. It's just a variable that we need to be considerate of, you know, but also having those open conversations. So I think first, like thinking back to the key principles of coaching female athletes, it's obviously have that understanding of the menstrual cycle. You know, it affects people in loads of different ways. But I think the key thing is understanding that you're going to have to be fluid in terms of your coaching approach. You know, you're going to have, and no different to anybody else. Do you know, you're going to have to change around. You're going to have to adapt it because guess what? That person might get affected by that cycle differently next month. And then the month after. So it is a variable that you're just going to have to consider. But that's where true art of coaching comes in, you know?
Oh, 100%.
You know, so thinking about a key principle of coaching female athletes, aside from obviously the menstrual cycle, we jumped into that, guys, off the back of Dina Ash's comments. But what's the next thing that is always a big consideration for yourself, mate, when you've got a team of youth athletes? Because I know you coach quite a few soccer, football teams and stuff like that as well.
So I think a lot of people, when they think of coaching female athletes in multi-directional sports, the first thing they tend to think about is injury burden and ACL rupture. So I'm heavily involved in the rehabilitation of female athletes, and ACLs are the main sort of catastrophic. I hate using that word, but catastrophic because of the time involved to recovery.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the main injury. So I think when it comes to working with young athletes, young female athletes and adult female athletes, it's having to think about what are you doing to better reduce risk. We can't do injury prevention. There's no such thing as injury prevention because the only way to avoid a sports-related injury is to not play sports. So there's going to be an inherent risk factor. But if you are working with female athletes, you need to understand, okay, so what's the injury burden? If we pick ACL, we have to then understand, okay, so how do these injuries happen? So what we sometimes talk about is like the mechanisms of injury. And then we start to think, okay, so it's a combination of lots of different things. It's if it's a non-contact one, they're going to have a planted foot. There's going to be internal versus external rotation of the tibia and the femur. That's going to stress the ACL, and then the hip's going to adduct, so it's going to go towards the midline, and that's going to cause a rupture. So you have to sort of reverse engineer that, and you have to think, okay, so I need to have really good, strong control of the hips. So we need to do our glute med stuff. We also need to be very explosive because that's the thing, like strength. I mean, I'm biased, but strength is a really good panacea for avoiding injury. If we can be strong and robust, then that's quite useful. So do we have dynamic control of the hip, but do we have strong lower limb muscles? Because another thing, just trying to undo some of the myths, is people get into this habit of assuming that females are at more risk of an ACL injury because of the Q angle, so how wide their hips are. Now, I've worked with rugby athletes, I've worked with powerlifters that have some hella wide hips and their knees don't explode every time they do some training. So what we tend to see is if we look at the research that was done in the past, it's that they would compare males to females, but when there was less investment in female athletics, female sports, they would enter with a much lower training age. So if you imagine, you might have young lads in football academies that have been in a system and had structured S&C from, say, the age of 8. Whereas with female athletes, they probably haven't had that structured high-quality S&C until much later in their teams when they're fully matured and developed. So it's not about, oh, females are at greater risk. It's more about, okay, training age is a massive variable to take into account when we're thinking about female athletes, because 9 times out of 10, it might be that they've got a lower training age compared to a male counterpart. So just doing good quality S&C and exposing them to quality movement is as much use as any other structured injury prevention strategy, in my opinion.
No, and I think what's really interesting is if we look at some of the latest research that's coming out, there was some great ones on interventions, reducing ACLs with change of direction, changing sprint mechanics in footballers, reduce the chances of hamstring injury and stuff like that. It's basically, it is just that, just building a better, more proficient athlete, isn't it? It stands to reason if an athlete hasn't got great control of their torso, their trunk, and they're flailing around like a tree in the wind, they're not going to be efficient. So there's going to be compensations, which is going to put structures at risk, and the body will always go to the most metabolically efficient path. Doesn't always make it the best path. It's not the biomechanically efficient, but it's metabolically efficient. And that's why you see limbs going all over the place. So ultimately, some of the research now, some of the best preventers of injury is actually always about just reinforcing great technique, and I want to credit the authors, but it absolutely escapes me of changing maximal velocity running technique. And its effect on hamstring injury. I was literally just talking about it last night, and the names have completely escaped. But actually, just that small tweak they made to max velocity running and the impact it had on the activity of the hamstring was massive. You're saying just improve technique, improve technique.
I think it's really easy to overcomplicate S&C, and a lot of people have to make these really complicated or exciting claims. When in reality, if someone asked me like, what does an S&C coach do? And when students at the university who come in, it's like, what does an S&C coach do? We get people moving well, and we just try and get them better at their sport. So physically, we do the physical bit to help with the technical and tactical. And I think you can really get that paralysis by analysis if we're trying to think all the different stuff that we need to do. When get them moving well. If they need to run, let's get them running efficiently. If they need to change direction, let's get them change direction properly. Do they need to be strong? Yes, everybody needs to be strong. So let's get them strong and moving well.
Yeah. So I think obviously the next key principle of coaching female athletes, and I suppose it transcends into any athlete realistically, is consider training age, consider the exposure they've had to training. Obviously, don't compare. If somebody's had a decade of training and somebody's had 2 years of training, it's not fair to make that comparison. No. The amount of exposure they've had to it. So that's going to be your next core key principle when it comes to coaching female athletes. How much exposure have they had to good level of training?
That's it. How much and what the quality is.
Yeah. Quality is an important one, because I think everybody seems to call themselves an S&C coach these days.
We could talk for a while about that.
we can, but there's not enough hours in the day, I think. But next one I want to bring up is more the grey area in terms of the psychological. I think it's the stuff that connects the sets, the reps, everything that sits outside of the technical stuff. And it's actually the psychology. One thing that I realized very early on is my female athletes will strive to endure a hell of a lot more than what my male athletes will. Like, my female athletes would run through walls if they could. Literally just push. So I think the psychological aspect is important. I don't know if you would agree with that, mate. Is there anything that you've noticed for yourself with coaching female athletes? The psychological aspect of it.
One thing that is purely anecdotal, although there is some research out there to support it, is essentially what I've found is, especially when I've been coaching similar level female teams and male teams at the same time, as you often do when you're sort of starting out in your career and you do bits and bobs in various bits, is when you work with academy males, everything's a competition and they all want to show you who's the best. When you work with female athletes, the almost focus becomes on the cohesion of the team and how good the team is. So there's almost like there's a group mentality that's sort of pre-existent in the female athletes and teams that I've worked with, whereas it's been a bit more of a competitive, individual focused environment for the males. And again, I assume that's not true for everybody, because I've met some hella competitive women athletes that just do want to show that they're the best. And I've met some lads that are focused on the team and the team outcomes. But that's one thing that I've sort of noticed from my own practice, is that it tends to be, and I'm a sweeping statement, I know, but in the female clubs, it's very much focused on the group. What's the group doing? How the different people are contributing to the group outcome. And with the male athletes, it's been very much about who's our best player, who's the best, who's the fastest, who's the strongest, who scored the most goals, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that I have found with my female athletes more is, if you try and lighten the load or make a session easier in session, like, never goes down well. Never. That, I must say, that is like 95% of the female athletes that I've coached. If I have to regress them in session, never ever goes down well. I don't know why. It's that competitiveness, and they don't like to feel like they're making it easy, or they feel weaker, or whatever it may be. But that has always been a consideration of mine. Right? Am I pitching the intensity of this session? And that's why my warm-ups will slightly different, but the conversations at the start of the session will change quite a bit. So my programming, I try and give the athletes a little bit more leeway. When it comes to females, so a lot more reps in reserve. Rather than going kind of 1 to 2, I'll stick an extra couple of reps on, so I'll go into kind of 1 to 4 reps in reserve, just so people can handle the intensity on any given day, if that makes sense. I don't know if you would agree with that, mate.
Yeah, and I do something very similar. So, like, at the start of any session, we discuss sort of what our outputs are that we want, what are our outcomes. So, say if it's a strength session, we've got our core lift, we've got a couple of accessory, and then we've maybe got a bit of a conditioning style circuit or some power, depending where we are in the season. And there'll be almost options. That tends to be with the teams that I work with at the moment, that works the best. Is this is your non-negotiable, so you have to hit this amount of volume on your core lift, so if it's a squat or a pull from the floor or something like that. And then it's like, if you're feeling really fresh, so this is your green. If you're feeling a bit janky, say maybe we had a really heavy game, then this is your yellow, so this is what you need to. If you're feeling rubbish, or you're injured, or there's other things going on, then you hit your green. And we have that for all of our stuff, like our weights and our conditioning. There's always these bands, and they have a band that they're supposed to be in, but then there's that flexibility. So it gives me the sort of structure that most coaches like, if they're doing this, and this, but it gives them the flexibility. And if they've got the confidence to communicate that with you, that, yeah, I need to back off today, or yeah, I can really put my foot on the gas today. And that's just something that tends to work for me, I think.
Yeah, like I said, and I think once I implemented that, it did correlate with like the first principle that we looked at as well. Just allowed the variance in there as well. When they feel great, they can push, and obviously that's dependent on their cycle and how they feel within that. But it's just, again, it goes back to that flexibility of being a coach. It's being a proactive coach and having the foresight of, how am I going to manage the variables, not give them so much leeway where they can just slack off and go here, there, and everywhere, but give them enough so they can not feel pressured where they have to do 4 sets of 8 at this specific weight or something like that.
That's it. And it's you just being smart as the coach and saying, right, if I'm chasing strength, we need to keep the intensity, but we'll chop the volume. So yeah, keep the intensity in that range, but we'll take a set or 2 off the end. If it's that, your pre-season, you're trying to put some layers on, it's a case of, well, I need to accumulate volume. So if I'm asking you to hit, 8 to 12 and you just hitting 8, well, let's have it 8, but keep the same sets. It's just, it's you're the coach. So you're telling them the most appropriate things to do, but you've also got to be that sort of receptive to where they currently are, and then you can make the most appropriate adaptations for them. But it should never turn into that oh, you just do what you want sort of session.
Yeah, they never end well. They never ever end well.
They tend to end quickly as well, I've noticed.
Exactly that. So, mate, I know we took quite a bit of your time there, but what's the final principle? Or is there anything else that you think, right, is a key principle of coaching female athletes? Is there anything else out there that you think, right, this is kind of my non-negotiable when it comes to coaching female athletes?
I think and this is more for youth female athletes, because I talk like a coach, and I think most S&C coaches, we have a similar way of talking. in terms of the language we use, the way we motivate our players. So if I've got, say, a 12-year-old goalkeeper and we're working on some power, she perhaps doesn't want me to shout in her face, "You absolute unit," or something like that. Whereas if I'm working with a male, that might be the sort of language that helps motivate them. And I think one thing that I initially used to sort of blow off as like, it doesn't matter. When I've reflected more and more, and when I've got older, I've tended to think about the words we use, especially with young athletes and especially with young female athletes, are massively, massively impactful. And when I'm working with young coaches and when we've got interns with us, it's one of the first things that I tend to pick up on that makes me maybe, a little bit unhappy with what they're doing. Like, anybody can bomb a session because we can plan it to be great, but if we're saying things in a way that's perhaps not conducive with their perceptions of their self, their body, their quality as an athlete, then we could stop that straight away, because that's easy to stop. So it's trying to make sure that the language you use is really, really sort of hooked into the players you're working with. And that's not just for females, that's for anybody. But that is one thing with young female athletes. I think the way we talk to them, communicate to them about physical things is very important, because unfortunately in the modern day, a lot of people have some very complicated relationships with their body, what they look like and what they feel like. And if we feed into that as a coach in a negative way, then that's a massive issue in my eyes.
Yeah, I heard a horror story at a local football club, a local youth football coach, because obviously at a certain age, obviously male and female can still play. Obviously, youth girls and boys are able to sort of still mix. And this bloke came out with something absolutely horrendous. Something along the lines of girls can't even kick the ball that far, or something like that, in front of a lot of. And it was just like, I think if I was there, I would probably still be inside a jail cell, because I just dislike that.
We should challenge that.
Yeah.
Back yourself and be brave. If this is one of the downsides of working in women's football at a lower league level. I've got myself in trouble a lot of times and had a lot of, verbal warnings because of the type of stuff that often parents of opposition teams will shout at members of my team. It's you wouldn't say it to their face. You wouldn't say it if it was my daughter and I was in front of you. You wouldn't use the language you were using to address her, because I'd probably have quite an emotive and a physical response to you. So don't say it because you stood at the sideline. We should talk and communicate in the way that we think would be effective for any girl of any age, any woman, any man, anything like that. So it is really important. And it's just again, talking about horror stories, I was really excited once to do a bit of private contracting with, I'm not going to name anything obviously, with a gymnastics club. I was there an hour, and I'd seen one coach refer to a 13-year-old girl to her face as being fat 3 times in one debrief. Picked up my bag and I went. I'm like, this is like, I've never been so disgusted by something in my life. And that was just down to the way they were communicating. They might have been they were a good coach. They might have been the most effective coach, giving the most effective feedback. But what's been involved in that process was completely unacceptable.
And I think that's the thing, is I think a lot of people on the language part of it and the coaching is, coaches seem to be kicking the can down the road. They don't take ownership of, right, actually, I need to stop this now. I need to confront it. I need to get past the stigmas. I need to go through this, and this. I need to address the terminology, the language, etc. And it's like, I'll kick the can down the road. But the problem with that, especially with youth athletes, if you keep kicking the can down the road, that is going to turn into a real big issue further down the line. And we've already got loads of body confidence issues. The dropout rate in sport of females when they get to 13, 14 is like going off a cliff edge. We really need to tackle that from very, very early on from a big piece. So I think just to wrap up for everyone, feel free to sort of change any of these principles. So first things first, looking at the menstrual cycle, obviously do your research into it, look at it. What is it? If you don't know, don't be intimidated by it. It's not a taboo subject. It's just a variable of coaching that you need to consider. It's no different to external life stresses, nutrition, sleep, any of that sort of stuff. It's something that you need to be aware of so you can make sure that you're coaching effectively. Kind of the next one, obviously, coach good technique. If obviously the state of funding in the UK is starting to shift greatly, but typically if you've had female athletes who haven't had high amounts of exposure to good level quality S&C. That is a consideration if you're comparing that to young academy males or something who've been playing or done certain coaching for such a long time. Obviously, psychology, big part of it. Have that bit of variance in there as well. And final one, obviously, the language that you're using. To be fair, I think with all of that, probably 10% obviously applies to females, and I think everybody applies to athletes, but I think it's just some core key principles. I don't know if there's anything else that you'd want to add to that, mate.
No, I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's like anything when you're talking about broadening inclusion or equality and things like that. No, it's not treat everybody the same, but it's also not treat everybody like everybody's got these inherent differences. They're athletes, they're there. You're a coach, you know what an athlete needs. You do it, but you just make allowances for you always train the person in front of you, don't you? Even if you train in a team, you train the individual and what's good for them. Have I dropped out there?
There we go. Sorry. What happened there?
That's good.
Yeah. So hopefully, Josh, you kind of rounded that up, mate. You summed that up for us perfectly. But guys, as always, if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out. Apologies that we're coming to you a little bit later, and apologies this was actually a shortened episode. It was just the fact of it was the only time that we could actually make our schedules work, trying to crowbar everything. Everybody's living busy lives. So again, massive apologies for that. But next week, we'll make sure we do a bumper one for you. And Josh, we'd love to get you back on, mate. It would be great just to spin this out. And we've got a whole host of topics that we want to discuss anyway, mate, haven't we? So we'll be seeing that lovely beard of yours very, very soon, I'm sure.
Great stuff. Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
No worries. Right, all the best, guys, and we'll catch up again very, very soon.